All right, Erev Tov again, everybody. Parashat Kedoshim, and Nechama has a lot of magnificent essays on this parsha, and we're going to look at one of them. It's a little bit of a long one, kind of three main sections, and we will make our way through together. I'm going to share my screen so we can get started. Okay, thou shalt not hate thy brother in thy heart. In his introduction to the Ten Commandments, in Exodus chapter 20, verse 2, Ibn Ezra states, this is itself a fascinating categorization. There are three categories of commandments: those governing man's mind, his tongue, and his acts. In the first category, there are precepts and prohibitions. I assume that means positive and negative commandments. You should love the Lord your God, and you should love your neighbor as yourself, are positive commandments. You should not hate your brother in your heart is a prohibition. So just as we're beginning the Aseret Devarim, Ibn Ezra gives us this sort of broad framework for how to think about all the mitzvot of the mind, mitzvot of the tongue, and mitzvot of action. And within mitzvot of the mind, loving God, loving your neighbor, and not hating your neighbor are in there. Many have thought that, except as the Ibn Ezra continuing, many have thought that except in the case of idol worship, bad thoughts are not considered as sins. This is not so. Idolatrous thought is not the only, but rather the worst kind of sin of thought. We find proof of this in the verse in Mishlei. There are 6 things which the Lord hates, one of which is a heart that devises wicked thoughts. Again, an indication that idolatry is not the only prohibited thought, other kinds of wicked thoughts. Furthermore, we read in scriptures, you did well in that it was in your heart, and do good, O Lord, to those who are good, and to those who are upright in their hearts. V'layesharim b'libotam. And elsewhere, I, the Lord, search the heart. Okay, so this is Ibn Ezra giving us the categorization of these three realms of mitzvot, the mind, the tongue, and actions, mind equating to heart here, as is often the case biblically, and then focusing in on the fact that there are a range of mitzvot of thought. And now she's going to apply this, Nechama applies this to our chapter, and says in our chapter, that being Vayikra Yud Tet, the kind of epicenter of Vayikra, often called the Holiness Code, with its wide range of mitzvot of all kinds. As we'll see, actually, she doesn't discuss a different thing I was looking at, discusses the range of mitzvot. She doesn't discuss that here. In our chapter, the order is acts, speech, and thought. The second, meaning speech, comprises legal procedure and investigation and evil talk. We are now dealing with the commandment referring to the mind and the heart, verses 17 to 18, at both extremes, hate and love. So let's understand what she's talking about here to apply the Ibn Ezra. She's pointing out that we have a wide range of mitzvot in chapter 19, and within them there is a section which follows the Ibn Ezra's sort of categorizations, in which he arranges as mind, tongue, and acts, and they're in reverse order in this middle section of Vayikra 19. So 11 through 13 are acts: don't steal, don't deal deceitfully, don't swear falsely by my name. Interesting. That could very well be thought of as tongue. Don't defraud your fellow, don't commit robbery, don't hold on to the wages of a laborer, don't insult the deaf or place a stumbling block before the blind. You shall fear your God, I am Hashem. Then we have the middle part, which is speech, legal procedure, and investigation. You shall not render an unfair decision. Again, interesting categorization. We could think about that as an action, but here it's sort of a speech because the judgment is delivered by mouth. Don't favor the poor or show deference to the rich. Judge your kin fairly. Do not deal basely with members of your people. Also translated sometimes as don't go about talebearing amongst your people. Do not profit by the blood of your fellow Israelite. I am Hashem. Again, could really dispute Nechama's categorization of these as speech acts. And then the last portion here, and you can see why she's understanding these as kind of different groupings because they have I am Hashem endings, so they're sort of units here. And now 17 and 18, a new unit. You shall not hate your kinsfolk in your heart, your brother in your heart. Reprove your kin, but incur no guilt on their account. Don't take vengeance or bear a grudge against members of your people. Love your love your fellow as yourself. Ani Hashem. Again, we don't have to necessarily make too much of her application of the Ibn Ezra's three groupings and how she matches it here for our purpose, but just enough to see that she accepts his framework and offers it as a way of interpreting the layout of the middle here of chapter 19, and says, we're focused now on mitzvot of the mind and the heart at both extremes, hate and love, interspersed with precepts involving speech and deed. So maybe she's acknowledging it's not quite so simple of a breakdown as we said before. The question arises, okay, so that was her, again, mapping Nechama is not always easy. She doesn't give us her sections, just paragraph after paragraph, but we could sort of say like, this was her opening, new idea, a way of categorizing mitzvot provided by the Ibn Ezra, an attempt to apply it to the broader context in which our mitzvah finds itself. And now we're going to zero in on our mitzvah, don't hate your neighbor in your heart, and ask some questions, maybe even still on the broader range of these mitzvot in verses 17 and 18. The question arises whether it is at all possible to command thoughts. After accepting that there are mitzvot about them, we now back up and ask, how can one be held accountable, or can one really legislate about thoughts? Rav Chasdai Kreskas questions the view that I am the Lord your God is a positive commandment. So this, again, she's circling back to Aseret HaDvarim as kind of the starting point for thinking about major questions pertaining to mitzvot, and now applying them here to Kedoshim, which some have argued is kind of like a next order of the Ten Commandments, or that many of the Ten Commandments are sort of the headers into which some of these mitzvot fall. So we can suggest a tighter relationship between them, but even if not, we use frameworks that come from the Ten Commandments to now look at this major section of mitzvot. So question about the first of the Ten Commandments, I am the Lord your God, can it be a positive commandment? And Rav Chasdai Kreskas says, man can only be commanded to do or avoid something where he can exercise his free will, but not in matters over which he has no control. Seeming to understand that the existence of God, or our belief in God almost, is not something over which we per se have control. There's only a very small snippet of that Rav Chasdai Kreskas would be good to see it more in context. Ibn Ezra similarly questions the last commandment, lo tachmod, thou shalt not covet, and says, many are puzzled by this commandment. Is it possible not to covet? Is it possible not to covet something beautiful and pleasing? Meaning, is this, if this is a thought that arises in our brain, can a mitzvah really prohibit it? Is it possible to not have that happen? HaKetava Kabbalah elaborates, the heart covets spontaneously and is not subject to man's free will. With all of that set up, now we come to our pasuk. The same question could be asked regarding the commandment, Lo tisnat achicha bilvavecha, you should not hate your brother in your heart. How is it possible not only to control one's acts and keep in check one's tongue, right, our prior two categories of commandments, but also one's thoughts, wishes, and feelings? Ibn Ezra answers this question with his famous parable of the peasant and the princess, which illustrates that a person's desires and feelings do not emerge suddenly, but rather as a product of his personality, mentality, habits, and activities. I'm sorry I didn't produce or prepare that parable, but the footnote tells us that's from an earlier essay of Nechama's. I'll try to pull that up for next time. So the peasant and the princess, which illustrates that a person's desires and feelings do not emerge suddenly, but rather as the product of his personality, mentality, habits, and activities, right? So that is to say, we have some control over our thoughts because they emerge from the character that we cultivate. So the way we develop ourselves and our behaviors will ultimately impact upon our thoughts. So maybe as we just become, conscious, intentional beings, not quite yet, but over time, we can really shape our thoughts such that we could, cultivate a persona which responds to these various mitzvot of thought. The Sefer HaChinuch consistently affirms that the heart follows one's acts, that famous phrase of his, Acharei ha'pu'ulot nimshachot ha'levavot, and therefore, as we choose how to behave, our thoughts and our mental state is impacted by that. So we could shape that. Our sages give an excellent example of the way to eliminate hatred by acting in the right direction. Okay, so this question of how can you change whether you hate or don't hate, the Chachamim have a prescription of action that should help impact our state of hatred or not. What is it? The obligation of unloading the burden of a fallen animal normally precedes that of reloading in order to relieve it. In other words, if you're faced with two animals, an animal that needs to be loaded and a fallen animal that needs to be unloaded, you do the unloading first because that relieves the immediate anguish of the animal which has fallen with this burden pressing upon it. Yet the following ruling is given in Bava Metzia 32b. In a situation where a friend's beast has to be unloaded, and unloading we say should go first, and an enemy's animal needs loading, the latter must be attended to first in order thus to prevail over one's instinct. So we go where relative sensitivity to animal welfare has one set of priorities. When that comes up against the opportunity to cultivate in ourselves by helping an enemy, the kind of movement to quell an inner instinct towards hatred, that actually takes precedence. While they cooperate, and how does she imagine the effectiveness of this? While they cooperate, the person and the enemy whose animal is being loaded now, there will be an exchange of words, first only about the job in hand, but later a conversation may ensue. Their joint effort may bring them closer together, and the hatred will fade away. Okay, all I can say is halavai that life were that simple, but there's something to it. There's certainly something to it. Commenting in his Tirat Kesef on "Thou shalt not covet," Rav Yosef Kasbi states unequivocally, "It is clear that since we are able to overcome our impulse to hate, as stated, you shall not hate your brother in your heart, our inclination to bear a grudge, we can achieve this also in regard to coveting." So here, our pasuk is used sort of as a proof text. If God would only command us not to hate, if God believed it were possible for us to overcome and eliminate our instinct to hate. Now, of course, I added and eliminate. Here, it's interesting. What does overcome our impulse mean? Does it mean have the impulse and then be able to, ease it away? Or does it mean actually change ourselves so that the impulse never even arises? Sounds like it's the latter, that we can actually, with work, overcome, meaning eliminate our impulse to hate. But it's not so clear, right? And I think a lot of the answer to as I've always understood it, to the question of can you legislate, thoughts or emotional reactions is there's sort of two inner steps before we get to action expression of our emotions. There's instinct, and then there's sort of our reaction to our instinct, and then there's action. So we may have an instinctive hatred that arises in us, then we wrestle with that feeling, and then there would be any action that would arise out of it. I've always understood these mitzvot to sort of say we can't really ultimately eliminate entirely or completely shift our initial inner instincts, but we can react to them and ease them and soften them, and certainly therefore filter them before they get to action. And I think that question of sort of can we change our immediate instinctive reaction, or we can't change that but we can respond to it before it gets to action, is probably the debate about whether overcome our impulse means have our impulse and then overcome it before it gets to action, or actually overcome in the sense of eliminate our impulse, if that makes sense. Okay. The wording of this commandment may have been intended to aid us to combat the hatred in our hearts and to turn it into love. The precepts in this chapter referring to human relations concern father, mother, right, whom we're told to revere in the beginning of the chapter, the poor, the stranger, the deaf, the blind. We've seen those already, not to curse or put a stumbling block in front of the humble and the mighty in terms of how we judge people, and the aged, all of whom deserve special treatment. The terms amit, fellow, or rea, friend, are used throughout the chapter, each 3 times. Only in, and I think this is Nechama's insight, only in thou shalt not hate thy brother in thy heart is achim, your brother, or achicha, used in order to remind us to keep hatred out of or banish from our hearts. For your fellow being is more than your amit or rea. He is your brother. So here she's sort of reading it as all these other interpersonal, action-driven mitzvot refer to the counterpart in a whole variety of ways and descriptions. But when it comes to the emotions of the heart, there we're reminded about the strongest connection, so to speak, which is that the other is achicha, is your brother. And therefore, when you really take that to heart, it should be possible. The text, the Torah imagines that it's possible to combat the hatred in our hearts. Again, does it mean eliminate it, or does it mean react to it when it arises? By reminding us through the language of the mitzvah, that other person is in some way your brother. And if you really take that to heart, then you should be able to soften those emotions when they arise. Okay, so this is part 1, which is sort of the question of her take on the overall, first the intro, which was the groupings of mitzvot, and then within the area of mitzvot of thought, the recognition that there's a long-standing debate about whether mitzvot of thought can be legislated, and the general, recognition of the challenge, and then, strong stances that they can be in some way, and therefore this mitzvah has standing, and then her kind of textual insight that may be part of what helps us do that is that the Torah is emphasizing is the reminder that when it comes to this maybe most challenging of mitzvot, to frame the encounter always around the reality that this other is your ach. Oh yes, Bracha writes, other and brother are in the same word. I never thought about the possible relationship there. That's great. Other comments about this kind of opening section, mitzvot of thought, before we get into the next area? David L., please, you're muted.
Yeah, I apologize for not having printed it. Can you go back to the first page?
Yeah, absolutely.
And this may be a challenge of translation. Idolatrous thought is therefore the only, but rather the worst, is not the only, but the worst kind of sin.
Mm-hmm.
Now, when we use the word sin with regard to mitzvot, if somebody violates that mitzvah, they have to bring an offering.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. Do we bring offerings for sins of the heart?
That's a great question. I'm making a reminder to myself to see what I can find on that.
There is another religion that has people make offerings or confessions or etc. of sins of the heart, but I don't know that we do.
Right. I can't certainly no such instance jumps to mind. Yeah. So you're pointing out, therefore, that it's interesting that this could be the worst kind of sin and yet not carry the responsibility for a korban.
I'm troubled by the categories because I don't see them, or I haven't found it convincing, or I don't understand it, that they're parallel. We have a certain level of culpability with regard to our actions.
Right.
We have a lesser but still a culpability with regard to our words, and she's defined words very broadly. Words is more poetic. But
Yeah.
this idea of thoughts and feelings, I don't know what culpability we have.
Yeah. Okay. That's a great question and warrants a little research. So thank you. Thank you. Lance, go ahead.
There's a conflict here between abstraction and reality. For example, if you take the word prescription, which was mentioned, a doctor prescribes a liquid to cure your sinuses or whatever it might be. And then God prescribes some kind of action to prohibit your hatred. Now, those are two radically different types of things.
Mm-hmm.
One is concrete reality. And when you're talking about hatred and love and all these other abstractions, for example, hope. This morning I heard Rav Avi talk about hope. And hope to me is an abstraction and a delusion. But despite the fact that Rav Avi was great, don't misunderstand me. The thing is that when you're talking about Talmud, you're talking about social studies, you're talking about philosophy, religion, all that sort of thing. You're talking about prescriptions. And the line from Lou Costello rings true. I'm trying to think, but nothing's happening.
Great. Great. Appreciate all those thoughts and the, kind of question exactly as you said of what is prescription here and how do we understand it and its wide range of potential meanings. It's important. So thank you. Let's jump right back in as far as I could see and continue on with the next section. Okay, so we addressed, a beginning of addressing the question of this mitzvot of thought, and obviously important questions were raised about them that warrant further examination. There is another point, she tells us, that requires clarification. In the Torah, we find references to enemy, oivecha, and foe, sona'acha, literally one who hates, as if it were permitted to hate. Okay, so this is kind of an interesting question, right? The Torah tells us lo tisnad achicha bel vavecha, it's prohibited to hate your fellow, and yet it takes as a matter of fact in its descriptions of people we encounter out there in the world, people whom we hate. So how do we square these things? Again, my initial reaction to this is there are people about whom you have that feeling, but you haven't carried it out to action. Or, okay, the Torah acknowledges shortcomings. So there's, we have not lived up to our ideal if we have a person out there in the world that we hate, but nonetheless, that's a reality. The Torah is not going to turn a blind eye to it. And it knows that people fall short in those areas, and therefore it needs to give us particular instructions regarding those scenarios when they arise. Okay, but we'll see a couple of other takes that follow. In the law regarding the restitution of found objects, the Torah states expressly, if you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you should surely bring it back to him again. And in the case of an animal that collapsed under its load, the Torah commands, if you see the donkey of him that hates you lying under its burden, you shall surely unload it with him. Talmud asks, one who hates, so Nacha implies that the owner of the beast is hated by his helper, right? You see Chamor Sonacha, right? Which actually sounds like of one that you hate. It's going to be part of our discussion here. Talmud asks, does the Torah not state you should not hate your brother in your heart? So how could the Torah describe a reality which is reflective of a violation of a mitzvah itself? The sages of the Talmud presume that he who transgresses the latter will surely not obey the former commandment. What then is the purpose of this precept? Ibn Ezra offers a grammatical explanation. Read in Exodus 23:4. That's Shor Oyevecha. Read Oyivcha with the chirik under the yud in the transitive verbal sense, not as a noun, not your enemy, but the one who is grieving, who behaves enmiously, so to speak, to you, as in va'ayavta oyevecha. Thus, the meaning is he that is hostile to you. And likewise, sonacha, as indeed it is rendered in the English translation, right? Him that hates you, as opposed to your enemy or your hated, your whatever the word for person you hate is. So that's Ibn Ezra's grammatical explanation, which is, as she's going to spell out more, it's kind of it's a state, but not a fixed reality, so to speak. Rav Astruk elaborates on this in his Midrashei Torah, and you would hold back from unloading it, right? And the Torah says, no, you have to unload it. V'chadal tameh azov lo. This means that if you see the donkey of him that hates you lying under its burden, and he will not ask for your help because of his hatred for you, thereby demonstrating sona'acha, that he hates you, you must nevertheless not refrain from offering your help now that he needs you, though you do not need him. The Torah teaches you to ignore such conduct and behave in a noble-minded and magnanimous manner, offering your help. Okay, both commentators hold that the man enjoined to help is the hated and not the hating party. This resolves the above problem. So at least for the initial point of kind of this person is already a sinner. So how if they're hating, if they have a person they hate out there in the world, why are we giving them further instructions about behaving well towards that person? We already know they can't keep the mitzvah of don't hate your brother. So why are we bothering to give them instructions about treating that person that they hate well? Right? Again, the assumption that if they transgress the latter, don't hate your brother in your heart, they will surely not obey the former of treat well the animal of the person that you hate. So to this question, the answer is, well, we're actually talking about someone who hates you, not someone who you hate. So at the technical level of, how can we imagine that someone who hates somebody will then be at all interested in doing something towards the one that they hate? We have this sort of technical resolution. No, we're talking about you behaving well towards someone who's harboring hatred towards you, and you transcend, being impacted by their feelings for you, and you do the right thing vis-a-vis them. So both commentators hold that the man enjoined to help is the hated and not the hating party. This resolves the above problem. Some commentators adduce grammatical proof for this theory. If the owner of the beast were the hated party, not the person the Torah is talking to, then the Torah would write, and I think this is the crux of it, but I think that there's a typo here. I think the Torah would write senu acha, the one who is hated by you, as in ha'achat ha'ahuva, or ha'achat ahuva, v'ha'achat sinua, in Dvarim, where it talks about a man who has two wives, one who is loved by him and the other who is hated by him, right? So hated is sanu. And so I assume that it should say here, if the owner of the beast were the hated party, then the Torah would write sanu acha, your hated one. Since it says sonacha, it means the one who hates you. However, this is a weak argument, she says. Okay. Okay. Most of our commentators do not accept the interpretation of sonacha as he who hates you, but he whom you hate, and the question cited above still stands, right? Which is, how are we legislating or expecting someone to keep a mitzvah about treatment of another whom they hate if they can't even keep the mitzvah not to hate them? Again, we could give answers to that question. This is the starting point. We cite Maimonides' answer from Hilchot Rotzeach Ushmirat HaNefesh. How can one Jew hate another? Does not the Torah state you should not hate your brother in your heart? If, as our sages say, he alone saw him transgressing a commandment, warned him, but the sinner did not repent, in such a case, it is mandatory to hate him until he repents and mends his ways. Yet even if he has not yet repented, he must in an emergency be helped to unload and load. Okay, so Rambam's answer is, there is a group of people that we're actually commanded to hate, people whom we have attempted to, lead away from violation of mitzvot, and they have, betrayed or disregarded our warnings and wantonly sinned. Until they do teshuvah, we are commanded to hate them. Now, we can do with that as we wish. This attitude towards sinners, and I don't know whether the Rambam here is implying everybody is required to do that, or if it's just because you yourself invested in trying to lead them on the path towards mitzvot and they flagrantly ignored you. So there's a, for you specifically, there's a kind of my most charitable reading is like a righteous indignation towards them for, as opposed to just the idea that we hate all sinners. I don't think it's going in that direction. I think it's more specific to the relationship. Again, we could have lots of different ways of thinking about that relationship than the one that the Rambam is legislating here. But he understands resolving this issue that, there is an individual relationship or circumstance in which, sin'ah is the right approach, and it's vis-a-vis that person that the Torah is speaking, the one whom we're actually enjoined circumstantially to have this attitude towards, that still the Torah tells us if you encounter them in this emergency, you help unload and load. Just a brief pause for some home duties. I'll be back in a Okay. Thanks for bearing with me. Okay, same answer. So a similar approach to the Rambam, or the same, given by Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, another early medieval text of cataloging the commandments, positive commandments 80 to 81. How can the Torah refer to him that hates, seeing that it states you should not hate your brother in your heart, right? So presume this is about the mitzvah of helping the animal of your, the one that you hate, and the Torah is asking, and the Sefer Mitzvot Gadol is asking, how can we even have, this category existing in the Torah? It's a violation of a mitzvah, because he saw his fellow behave sinfully, warned him, but he did not repent. Scripture states the fear of the Lord is to hate evil, and do I not hate, O Lord, those who hate you? Nevertheless, the Torah bids us to be sympathetic and help him in his need. Accordingly, you should not hate your brother in your heart is not an absolute prohibition. From the two verses cited by the Sefer Mitzvot Gadol, we learn that we must not hate the wicked, but only wickedness as such. Furthermore, the psalmist does not say those who hate the Lord, but those who hate you, i.e., those who hate God, God's Torah, and all that represents the realization of God's will in the world. Sefer HaChinuch highlights the words in your heart, lo tisnah achicha bilvavecha. We cite from commandment number 238. One must not hate a Jew in one's heart, for it is stated, you should not hate your brother in your heart. Sifra explains that this commandment refers to secret, but not to manifest hatred. He who hates openly transgresses the prohibition, you should not take vengeance nor bear any grudge, and the mitzvah of love your neighbor as yourself. Nevertheless, secret hate is more pernicious than open hatred, and the Torah condemns it with special emphasis. The reason for the prohibition, this is a continuation of the Sefer HaChinuch, which usually gives an intro and then gives the reason and then gives other parameters and sources for the mitzvah. So the reason for the prohibition is obvious. Secret hatred causes strife, enmity, and informing, that most odious of traits. The Talmud and Midrash elaborate on the ramifications of this commandment and strenuously warn against allowing hatred to enter one's heart. This commandment applies everywhere. This last paragraph of the quote from Sefer HaChinuch, at all times, to men and women alike, those who transgress it and allow their hearts to harbor hatred against a blameless fellow Jew violate, I guess should be this negative commandment, but it is permitted, even obligatory, to hate the wicked, if after repeated warnings they persist in their iniquitous conduct As it is stated, do I not hate, O Lord, those who hate you, and do I not strive with those who rise up against you? This Sefer HaChinuch makes it sound like it's more broad. Maybe everybody can hate these sinners, which is harder to contend with. Sefer HaChinuch stresses the inadmissibility of hatred, noting the exceptions when hatred is permitted in a few brief words. However, the Meshech Chachma of Meir Simcha Bdevinsk rejects all the exceptions in his commentary Meshech Chachma on Deuteronomy 22, where he dwells on the difference between your enemy's ox and the donkey of him who hates you in Exodus 23:5 in Mishpatim, and your brother's ox and brother's donkey in Dvarim. And he says, you should not see your brother's donkey, etc. That's in Dvarim. Whereas in Mishpatim, we read the donkey of him that hates you. Indeed, the Gemara asks, is it permitted to hate? Does the Torah not command you should not hate your brother in your heart? The Talmud answers that it is allowed to hate a person who has committed a sin. However, this is a very Meshech Chachma analysis. However, this was before the sin of the golden calf, when all of Israel were a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Then it was permitted to hate the blatant sinner because that was such an exceptional case, and the national standard was so high. Not so after Israel's repeated sinning. Henceforth, post Egel HaZahav, which is the beginning of or the paradigm of repeated sinning, henceforth, whenever encountering a sinner, we must examine our own conduct, which is not free of faults. It is therefore forbidden to hate anyone unless one's own behavior is blameless. But such persons are rare. As the Talmud states, I have seen eminent men, but they are few. Hence, the Torah uses in Dvarim, for example, after the golden calf and the other sins, the term the brother. This eliminates the exceptions to the injunction, you shall not hate, for how can we claim to be in the category of eminent men? Right? So he's pointing out basically the same sort of mitzvah talks first about the one who is hated in Shemot prior to the golden calf, and in the same type of mitzvah being described in Devarim after the golden calf and all the other sins of Bnei Yisrael through, Sefer Bamidbar, I guess in particular, it now refers to the person as your brother, showing sort of elimination of the category of the one who you hate from the Torah, and explains that by the kind of passage through the experience of the golden calf and these national and many other sins, that we no longer kind of have this category of the hate-worthy sinner because its sinning is so widespread that we're sort of, it's an unreasonable standard to hold someone else to and respond to them in that kind of way because we have our own issues to contend with first, essentially, which is a really fascinating insight. And I'm trying to look for where this footnote, yes, I don't know why exactly she places the footnote here, but I don't know if it's this whole Meshech Chachma, which she footnotes beautifully. This was brought to my knowledge by my brother, Professor Yeshaya Leibowitz, especially appropriate, I guess, because of the brother reference, and just cool to see a little crossover episode, as they call it, between Professor Yeshaya Leibowitz and Nechama. So, and also just an amazing Meshech Chachma to reflect on and think about how kind of a change in our national status and history and behavior impacts our capacity to, whether there's really any exception anymore, whether we can hate others for sinning. We now cite Nachmanides, the Ramban. You should not hate your brother in your heart. People generally conceal their hatred. As it is stated, he who hates dissembles with his lips and lays up deceit within him. Hence the Torah enjoins, now this "we now" is really the introduction to our last section, which is the context of this pasuk. Hence the Torah enjoins, you shall certainly rebuke your neighbor. This is an additional commandment, to rebuke one's fellow in order to lead him onto the right path and not suffer sin on his account. As Onkelos renders it, you should not be punished for his transgression if you do not admonish him for his sinful act. Thereupon we were enjoined to love him. He who hates his fellow violates a positive commandment. In my opinion, the act of rebuking is meant here as practiced by Avraham when he reproached Avimelech concerning his wells, and Avraham rebuked Avimelech because of the well of water. The Torah commands, you should not hate your brother in your heart when he displeases you, but reprove him. asking why he had acted thus, and do not suffer sin on his account by hiding your resentment in your heart and failing to challenge him. For when you reprove him, he will apologize to you or repent his sin, which will thus be forgiven. Just to remind ourselves of the pasuk here. Lo tisnad achicha bilvavecha, hocheach tochiach et amitecha, v'lo tisa alav chet. Don't hate your brother in your heart. Reprove your brother and don't carry any sin on their account. Right. So this is being kind of through the lens of the Ramban. She's, linking these together and saying, don't hate him in your heart when he's done something to upset you. That's the implied context. That's what would arouse a feeling like hatred when someone has caused you harm or displeased you. So don't hate him in your heart. Instead, what should you do? Reprove him, asking why did he act this way? And in so doing, by hopefully bringing it to light and opening the conversation, you won't suffer sin on his account. How would you be suffering sin on his account? Because you would be hiding that resentment in your heart and failing to challenge him. When you reprove him, the optimistic reading here, he'll apologize to you or repent, which will thus be forgiven. Hold on one second. Okay. Thus, in the Talmud and Archin, whence the obligation to rebuke a person for any misdemeanor? Because the Torah states, tocheach, you should certainly rebuke. And whence the need to repeat this if unheeded? Because the Torah states, tocheach, surely rebuke, persistently. According to the second interpretation, the two parts of the verse are interrelated. The second obligation to rebuke rests on the offended party, who thereby enables the offender to make amends. In the words of Or HaChaim, do not determine that your fellow has acted against you out of malice, but judge him benevolently and reprove him. He may explain his act, and you will discover that no offense was intended, or he will apologize, and the fraternal relationship will be restored. Okay, so this understanding of the link between these things, if someone does harm to you, don't assume that it was just malicious, but approach with an orientation of reproof, which is actually about opening conversation. And the best possible outcome is what we hope for, that kind of the air is cleared and the relationship is restored. Thus, Nachmanides integrates the two parts of the verse, thou shalt not hate, to thou shalt rebuke, into a simple theme. However, the commandment to rebuke is not absolute and must be applied with great discretion, for it may provoke negative reactions. The person called to account may resent it and feel slighted at being lectured. Our sages thus stated, Rabbi Elah said in the name of Rabbi Elazar, Rabbi Shimon, just as it is obligatory to say that which will be accepted, so it is necessary to refrain from that which will be rejected. Rabbi Abba says this is mandatory, as it is stated, do not reprove a scorner, lest he hate you. Rebuke a wise man, and he will love you. Not everybody is fit to be rebuked, as noted by our sages in the Sifra. Rabbi Yochanan ben Nuri said, heaven and earth are my witnesses that I caused Akiva to be punished by Rabban Gamliel more than 4 or 5 times. Yet I knew that he loved me even more for it. And the Sifra casts further light on the fitness to rebuke. Rabbi Tarfon said, I swear that there is none in our generation who is qualified to rebuke his fellow beings. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah said, I swear there is none in our generation who is able to accept rebuke. If one says, take the splinter out of your teeth, the other retorts, take the beam out of your eyes. Rabbi Akiva said, I swear there is none in our generation who knows how to rebuke his neighbor. We're going to actually just wrap up with this last bit. The third part of the verse we'll leave for our own offline reading. In Rabbi Tarfon's view, there is none so blameless as to be entitled to reprove his neighbor for his sins. According to Rabbi Elazar, there are pious men fit to rebuke, but no one willing to listen. Rabbi Akiva blames neither the subject nor the object, but rather the manner of reproof in this generation, the failure in communicating the message. Sifra adds, your rebuke must not cause your fellow to blush, for it is stated, and not suffer sin on his account. Lo tisa alav chet, not as it was earlier suggested to be understood by Onkelos, that as you continue to, bear hatred in your heart for him by not reproving him, you're carrying a sin as a result, but rather rebuke him in such a way that doesn't lead you to be sinning on his account by having caused him embarrassment through the rebuke. So the last section, which we're not going to look at now, cites a more interpretation of, what is the sin, and she quotes a variety of interpretations, but we'll leave that for now. This was a long one. Hopefully we had a chance to kind of take in her main areas, just a moment's review. The introduction with these three categories of commandments, actions, speech, and thought. We spent some time, thinking about this notion of mitzvot, of thought. Can they really exist? And saw the different opinions arguing that they can really exist, and kind of starting with that point, and noting the special use of achicha in this particular mitzvah of thought, of not hating your brother in your heart. This is a real risk, and the emphasizing the relationship being that of a brother is oriented to try to help us really rethink the feeling, so that we can wrestle with the feeling based on the understanding that these mitzvot, are actionable mitzvot, because we can change our thoughts, if only by changing our actions or changing our personas. But those ultimately will circle back to impact our thoughts. And I shared my own perspective that I'm not sure we can really change instinctive reactions all that much, but the way we react to our instinctive reactions feels like, before we get to the realm of action, feels to me like the sort of most fertile area for change and development. Then we kind of dealt with a somewhat technical question. How can the first way of dealing with that question, how can the Torah, describe the reality of haters, if it tells us that, you're not allowed to hate? So one possibility was, it's someone who hates you. And so that the issue of, why would the Torah prescribe to a person who's already violating by hating someone a mitzvah of how to treat the person that they hate? We have no reason to believe that there's any, hope for them to observe that mitzvah. So we had the technical answer. It's talking about people who hate you. But then we move to the broader question, how are we supposed to understand the existence of people whom you hate, if the Torah prohibits you from doing that? We address the possibility that there is a permitted category of people to hate, whether that's all people are enjoined to hate them, and these being the people who were warned not to violate mitzvot, but they, did it anyway. Is everyone enjoined to hate them, or only the people who warned them? But in any event, that category exists, and that's perhaps who the Torah might be talking about it when it says sona'acha. I was more thinking just in the plain sense about the possibility that, it refers to people that, we hate because we are not perfect. And so we fall short on that mitzvah, and we still need to know how to interact with those people. And that's what the Torah is speaking to. Then we had the sort of notion of, not kind of someone who you formally hate, but you have this sort of mode of interaction with. And we had the Sefer HaChinuch talking a little bit about, secret hate being worse than explicit hate. We had the Meshech Chachma kind of actually suggested that hate, there's no one that it's permitted to hate nowadays. And then sort of moved to the relationship, that the movement within the pasuk, don't hate, and in fact process that hate, which is often just a reaction to how someone else has treated you, by trying to reprove them. And then the challenges of reproof, of tochacha, as well. So lot to digest, lot to think about, and happy if anyone has any other comments before we wrap up. Bracha, I see you wrote in. Yes, the center of achicha is chai. Yes, very relevant. Actually, I think it was it? No, it's later on. It's in Devarim. We have v'chei achicha imach. Let your, literally that middle part juxtaposed to the fuller word, that, connecting with the brother brings life, and our responsibility to kind of affirm life with our brethren. V'chei achicha imach. Yeah, David, go ahead.
Do you need to go and do what you need to do?
Nope, I'm good. I got 5.
I feel like I'm echoing Lance from last week. I appreciate your tolerance for us. Why did you choose this text at a time when hatred seems to be so present in the world? And what is it you want us to take home?
Thank you. You know, as I peruse the essays, there's probably two categories that drive the choice, two or three. One is not too short and not too long, although this one might have fallen into the too long category. One is, I guess, ironically, sometimes I like to look at, Nechama's takes on things that are familiar to us if she offers a different approach. And sometimes I like to look at things that are, the less well-trod path. And, there's certainly some things in this analysis that are familiar, but I think it's kind of the foil to not the foil, it's the counterpart to V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, and that's what's often discussed in this section. So I wanted to look at this counterpart. So that was sort of driving it. But yeah, at some level, just unpacking some of the texts about hate, and a time is exactly as you said, when that's so rampant, was on my mind. And no, I hadn't gotten as far as the desired takeaway. I mean, I think the Meshech Chachma is really, really stood out as just fascinating in terms of thinking about the development of, wrongdoing, and that sort of notion of we always have to look inwards first. And that stands out to me. And and the move from don't hate but rather rebuke, if when rebuke can happen, is sort of the call to shift from the frame of mind of just knee-jerk emotional reaction to engaging in some kind of dialogue, a dialogue that, I mean, begins at some level in its best form, I think, with inquiry, like moving from the hey, why'd you do that to the why did you do that? I think is like the movement that I think these these psukim are trying to encourage us towards, that certainly resonates with me in this time. So thanks for the opportunity to think about that a little bit out loud, and welcome any responses.
We should think about it more. It does, some of it seems rather quaint.
Yep.
And of a different era.
Yes.
And I think it would be interesting to really try to unpack it.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Dad?
I'm not going to answer any questions, but I was just taken so much by the number of sources she quoted this time. Maybe that's because it was a longer essay. I think not. I think it's just so many commentators wrote about this, and she was able to, find them and quote them.
Yeah.
I thought it was quite remarkable.
Yeah. Yeah. A lot of rich commentary. Yep. Great. Yeah. And I just circling back again, David, to what you said, I agree that, an analysis of hate, mitzvot, of feeling, and the relationship between hate and rebuke, with the deepest respect for the grounding and founding work of all these commentaries, like, yes, there's more development for today that I think is warranted. So consider this a starting point, and where parts of it sort of rankle us, we notice that, and the parts that resonate we notice, and the sections that feel missing, we're conscious of. I haven't seen whether Rav Shai tackled this in either of his essays on this parsha. I don't recall. And obviously, I'm sure there's a lot of very contemporary stuff that's been written on it. So
he tackles it a little bit in the new book, whether we're obligated to love our enemies.
Yes. Yeah. Great.
Yeah, that's good stuff. Thank you.
Thanks to everybody, as always, for accommodating the schedule, and great to learn together. Love to Mom and Dad, and good night to all. See you next week. Next week, Tuesday night again, we'll be on our way out of Yom HaAtzmaut, since Monday night is Sunday night. I guess public service announcement. Sunday night at SAR High School is our community-wide Yom HaZikaron observance. Monday night, the Orthodox shuls particularly are gathering together at YIOZ for Mincha, transition, and festive Tefillah Chagigit for Ma'ariv for Yom HaAtzmaut. That's Monday night. And then Tuesday is HIR barbecue, and followed by Parashah. Good night to all.